This episode is brought to you in association with Janus Henderson Investors. It is for promotional purposes, is not for onward distribution, and the value of an investment can fall as well as rise. Past performance is not a guide to future performance, and nothing in this episode should be construed as advice. Our discussion is for illustrative purposes only, and references made to individual securities should not constitute or form part of any offer or solicitation to issue, sell, subscribe, or purchase the security. Retirement will probably be one of the most significant events you go through in your life, so it's not something you should leave to chance. However, knowing what to expect from retirement, working out how much you'll need, and how you're going to get there isn't always easy. But that's okay. In this episode, we're going to have a look at how you go from the thinking about it phase to the doing something about it phase when it comes to planning for our retirements. We'll speak to a leading financial advisor from Milton and Co, Felix Milton, to understand what provisions are needed for a comfortable lifestyle and the savings habits required to get people closer to their goals. We'll also talk to Botwright and Joanne about their experiences in building their pension pots. Joe, shall we start with you? Do you want to give us just a little bit of background on, who you are and your age and family, etc.?
Yes, so I will be 52 in April. I am currently single. I am currently employed. But at 52, you're suddenly looking down the possibility of being made redundant at any time in an ageist world.
Okay, what do you do for a career?
I'm an executive assistant.
Okay, and you said you're planning to retire in maybe 12 years' time, did you say?
I think when it gets to this stage, I think there's two things. You plan to retire, maybe, when you're in your early 60s, that would be nice. But A, how much is life going to cost you? And B, will this current working world allow you to work that long? So maybe there's also a slight worry that we'll have forced retirement a bit earlier.
Okay. And Paul, do you want to just explain a little bit about your background?
I'm Paul, I'm 54, married with 3 children. And I've worked in telecoms all my life, so 36 years. So I've done 2 lots of sort of 15 years with larger corporations. When I got to 48, I came out of all that and the comfort of it and started my own telecoms agency, which I still own and manage.
Do you have a sort of target when you would like to retire?
As soon as possible, really. But I think, things change over time. I probably initially had a target goal of 55. I'm 54 now, and that's not going to happen. So, things change over time. And I think what I'm looking at now is probably, 60 would be ideal, maybe stretching into 65. Again, it depends on what happens over the next 5-10 years. As Joanne was saying, it's a changeable world out there, so who knows when that's going to happen.
Felix, so do you want to describe a bit about Philip J. Milton and Co?
So we've been going for a few years now, and I joined the firm 8 years ago, and I became a chartered financial planner at the age of 23. So now we give advice and have discretionary permissions to manage clients' investments, and we have clients all over the world.
Well, let's get into the conversation then about retirement. And I want to start with just sort of the run up to the age of 50. And Felix, let's just start. Do you think in that run up, let's say from the age of, when you start working 2025 up to 50, do you think many of us neglect pensions or thinking about pension saving in those early years?
I think the vast majority of us neglect thinking about pension savings. I mean, when you're young, you've just started a job, you're not thinking about what 50-year-old you wants, you're thinking about the here and now. When you start work, you probably don't have a family, you don't own a house, so you're going to have different priorities. So saving for your retirement is something that you may do, but you're not going to be highly prioritizing that on your scale of things you want. Probably buying a house is going to be up there, raising a family, having children. So yeah, we definitely sort of kick the can down the road, or almost too much sometimes.
Paul, was that your experience? Did you think about pensions much when you were younger?
I think it was different when I started work. The ability to work for a company for a longer period was definitely there. I think that's changed now in the younger environment. I started with a large corporation and there was a final salary pension, so I'd have been crazy not to have started to invest into it, and it was mandatory, so we had to. I also saw my father contribute late into his pension. He wasn't until his late 40s when he started to put into his pension, and unfortunately he had to retire early. So He had to put a lot in at later time in life, so that was a real struggle for him. And as a result of that, I was in a positive position, so I could start to contribute early on.
So you felt like you'd learned that lesson from your father, that pension saving was something that was quite important from a younger age.
So, and it was a stable company I was working for, and I think the ability, as I said, to stay in a company for longer term at that time was something that was looked at highly. But as I said, I think things have changed now, and the ability to stay in companies for long term is probably not there anymore.
Felix, do you want to just describe what a final salary pension is, and also how common these were a few years back, maybe a couple of decades ago?
Benefit pensions are where it was a promise by the employer to pay you an income when you got to your retirement age. Now, this promise was not backed up by how much you paid in or even how much the employer paid in. So you would work for a company, it would usually have a fixed defined benefit. So say you'd get, 20/60ths of your final salary. That would be the multiple times it by the amount of years you work there. And then that would give you an income that the company would have to pay for the rest of your life effectively. Now, the problem with these schemes is that they are highly regulated and they are based on gilt yields. So gilts are government issued loan stock. So rather simplistically, those rates are directly linked to interest rates. When interest rates are, say, 5 to 10%, it's a lot less money that a company has to pay in, a scheme has to pay these pensions. But suddenly, with interest rates gradually going down and gilt yields, of course, going down as well, they've got to keep a much bigger pot behind to pay these defined benefits. So that's why we're seeing at the moment companies just don't offer these types of scheme anymore, because they're simply unaffordable for the majority of companies.
Okay, interesting. Joanne, let's just talk about your experience before the age of 50 as well. Was pension saving something that you thought about a lot?
My dad was very keen on pensions, and he effectively used to help me with my money management and made me take out a pension when I started work, when I didn't get a company pension. And he advised me and did a lot of that admin for me, which, although, I'm very very that he did do, but I didn't really think about it very much. I am a saver. My parents were savers. I naturally skew towards squirreling money away and not overspending, get credit, etc. So I was always in that kind of ballpark, but I definitely didn't have any kind of knowledge about it or training or meetings or advice until recently.
Okay, so you had a private pension that you were funding yourself.
Originally, and then I had company pensions, and now I am in the process of trying to work out what to do, which I know we'll come on to later. But now I have about 45 pensions. No, I have about 6 pensions, and my dad took me out of SERPs, and I don't know what that means. And pension companies change; they move on. Your pension gets moved on to another person, or another company, should I say? It's a minefield, really.
This is what we might call a defined contribution pension as well. So the outcomes are determined by what you put in. Felix, again, do you want to just sort of contrast that against DB schemes and also how the landscape has sort of changed so that DCs are now, quite common and really the main type of pension?
Yeah, of course. So defined contribution schemes are when the only certainty is what you put in. So typically under the auto-enrollment rules now, you'll be contributing a minimum of 8% to these pensions, made up of a 5% contribution from your earnings and 3% from your employer. Now, that's a defined amount that's going in, and it will be invested into the stock market. And the theory is that over a 30-year career or even longer, that pot of money will grow and you will have a bigger sum at retirement. Now, traditionally, these schemes used to be that you'd build up a pot, then you buy an annuity. An annuity is a guaranteed income for life that you simply buy. But now people go into what's called drawdown more often than not, when they can take as much or as little as they want and they pay their own income into retirement. So these pots are much cheaper for companies to provide because they know what they're putting in. There's a certainty aspect with, once we pay this money into the pension, we don't have to worry about it evermore. So they can do it sort of as and when, and they can link it to employees' pay.
So what's quite common is that you might have a defined contribution pension with your employer, but you also might have one privately as well. Am I correct?
Yes. So you can set up private ones, but typically what happens, as we've seen in Jo's case, is that she has gone between employment and has, the pot doesn't follow you, unfortunately. It stays sort of as it is, and then there'll be a new company scheme and you'll build up another benefit there. So you can get to a situation which is very common where you end up with 6 pension schemes that you need to consider when you get into retirement.
Yeah, and people they can lose track of those pensions quite easily, can't they?
Yes, but luckily there is the pension tracing service, which is a government website. And you can log on to that and type in details of your past employers, and they should be able to locate where your pension is. And then you can contact the company and say, do you have a record for me?
Okay. So it seems, Joe and Paul, I mean, you both were quite cognizant of the need for saving for retirement, and that you had those sorts of habits in place. Now, what I want to do, I just want to let's go to sort of the next part and have a little think about, what it is that we need. We've put those habits in place and we're saving, but what's the ultimate goal, really? Felix, let's start with you. I mean, how much is enough to be comfortable in retirement?
That's one of those how long is a piece of string questions, because everyone has an absolutely different standard of living that they want in retirement. So, you could be very, very frugal, and a single person will typically need slightly less than a couple. However, if the adage is you go on 2/3 of what your employment income is to sort of roughly replicate your standard of living in retirement. The reason it's 2/3 is that when you retire, some costs stop. So you're obviously not commuting anymore. You probably paid off the mortgage. Children have definitely left home and things like that. So your expenditures will go down slightly, and you're not needing to save anymore. So that's roughly how you'd work out, what you try and replicate in retirement. Now, everyone, though, is unique, and some people may earn significant sums and don't need 2/3, maybe a tenth of what they earn in retirement will be comfortable for them. But it's working out what works for you. And a very good way of doing this is doing what's called a budget planner. So think about all your outgoings, write them all down, and work out what that figure is. And if you go, right, that figure needs to continue for me to have a very comfortable standard of living in retirement, that's what figure you need to be targeting with all your retirement resources. We're very fortunate in the UK, we have the NHS, so more often than not, you don't need to worry about your healthcare costs. What we do see, though, however, is retirement is almost a U shape. So when you first retire, you go on holiday and there are lots of things you want to do. You see it obviously at the top of the U. Then you find you settle into retirement 10, 15 years down the line. You've done all the traveling. You've done all the big expenditure that you wanted to do whilst you were fit and young. And then you see that the expenditure drop again. So your incomes are probably more than your expenditure at this stage. And then as we get to later life, you start to go back up again with your expenditure as you have to pay for perhaps in-home care before maybe eventually moving into a care home. So they're fees that need to be considered sort of later down the line, but not necessarily ones that need to be factored in so much when coming up with the level of income you want for retirement.
What about life expectancies? Because that's one of the things I saw recently. They've gone up again. We do seem to be living longer and longer years. Do you think that sort of throws a spanner in the works when you're trying to think about your plans?
So always plan for living beyond your life expectancy it's a very good prudence rule. And also what you need to consider is, frankly, if you've got enough resources to consider your retirement, and even if you're considering retiring early, you're probably wealthier than average. So you probably need to at least do a forecast that you're going to live to the age of 100 to make sure you're very comfortable throughout your retirement.
Paul, did you have specific goals when you were thinking about your retirement?
I mean, I had some goals. I had some ideas of what I want to do, and I'm probably I still think of those on a daily basis. Of want to live on the beach, sail every day. That's my ultimate aim. But then I've got those goals in mind. So how I need to get there and what I need to do to put in place to get there is probably the bigger challenge.
So had you gone through things like how much you might want per year and the types of expenditures that would involve? Was there any detail in that respect?
I haven't probably done that budget yet. It's probably something I do need to think about. We haven't really had a steady state year, to be honest with you. So since I actually started my own business 6 years ago, and that drew from some of the money that we had. Again, we didn't have a house, so we're now going through purchasing a house at a ripe old age of 54, which is we're not first-time buyers. We don't benefit from any of those as well. So that's been a challenge. So the past sort of 6 years has been different probably from most other people in terms of environments. And I think Felix mentioned it. Not everybody's the same. So we've got certain things that we need to look at. I've got to pay a mortgage off probably in the next 10 years. I've got to plan for that and then think about the mortgage the pension and the pots and everything else that I have available to spend. So my budget's probably going to be slightly different to other people.
And it sounds like that transition from a very stable job, defined benefits scheme, you at one particular company for quite a long time, to then moving into being an entrepreneur, that must have completely changed the way in which you think about your finances, presumably.
Well, it's quite significant because the investment that you have to put into that business to get it up and running, and then sort of start to draw some salary from it, and then start to maybe put money into pension again is probably the last thing you start to think about, because you're just living at that stage. But now in a strong position that we can buy the house, we can start to put money back into the pension from the private company, and start to build that pot up again. And then with the company, I've got that plan then to sell it at some point as well. So that's the further income that I probably need some help in terms of from a tax and from a benefits perspective of when's the best time to do that, and do I sell it outright, or do I have that as a pension contribution going forward? So there's numerous things that I need to think about in terms of longer term. It would be good to get that advice, independent advice, in terms of what to do and how to do it and when to do it, to guarantee or to at least put something in place for the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years.
Joe, how about your experience in terms of planning for retirement? Did you think much about the size of the pot or the sort of details involved?
Well, I have been looking for some advice. I've tried a couple of times to get some advice, and I haven't been very successful in terms of how it's been approached. So when I've gone and said, this is the amount of money that I have, these are the investments that I've inherited, this is my property and all that sort of thing, then these are my pensions, and I get advice saying, well, you can consolidate your pensions and these are all the things that you can do. But it wasn't until I was talking to my friend Karen where she said, okay, you need to flip the question and say, ideally, just pick a random target of, I would like to retire at this age and have this much money. What do I have to do to get there, or can I get there? And start from that side of things. And because also I know so little, and I really struggle. I try and read stuff, but it interests me so little, and it's complicated. I can't get there. It's even things like, I've inherited some investments from my parents, which is obviously physical money. I don't get any money from those currently from those investments. It really is that basic. When you don't know anything about it, how do I get money from those things? I don't know how to actually pay for a pint of milk with that money, even though I know it's there. So that is very much how I'd like to, what I need to pick up. And also, it is just really, I find it very daunting. I do worry that I am leaving it too late.
What's prevented you from being able to find that financial advisor?
I find people are always trying to tell you what to do before you understand why you're doing it. So put all your money into this platform and you can see it, but why do I do that? And why would I use, and if I'm moving into my pensions into one, which one do I move it into? And then everyone says, well, you can invest things differently in your pension. Well, how do I know how to do that? It's almost like it's one big question. What do I do with my retirement? When actually I think it should be, as Felix was saying earlier, perhaps, smaller questions that you ask, and then you get to an end goal, rather than everybody just starting with what do you want, and you go, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Felix, what do you think about the complexities that both Paul and Joe describe here?
Joe's experiences are very interesting because she's almost described the older financial planning approach, which was very prevalent sort of previously, and it's now sort of phased out and more sort of going towards a lifetime cash flow way of financial planning. So really what a financial planner should do with Joe is sit down and think, right, what do you want your life to be? Ignore everything else. It doesn't matter what you've got at the moment or what assets you've got to consider. How do you envisage your retirement? And they should be able to help you think about that in some more tangible terms. So, if you sat there and go, I want £100,000 a year in retirement, and actually you've got 50,000 of assets, it's probably unrealistic. But actually, it's having these questions that you need to work out and think about. And because really, retirement is not stopping work. Retirement is when work becomes optional. So a lot of people actually continue working even though they can retire. So it's really important to remember that retirement is different for everyone, means different things for everyone, but it's what you want and what's going to make you comfortable going down the line. And in Paul's case as well, he's got a completely different set of scenario, final salary pensions as well to consider and things like that. How is he going to pay off the mortgage and debt in his retirement? And then eventually as he said, his living expenses should be relatively cheap. So again, he's going to have very different needs and a different way of looking at his lifestyle and his cash flow planning and things like that to Joe.
Okay, let's bring it back to sort of thinking about your retirement at the age of 50. I mean, I think what we've sort of heard is that it can be quite complex to think about, what those end goals can be. How would you sort of break them down? As sort of Joe described, it seems like it's a very big question to ask. So how do you sort of break that down and sort of come up with some realistic goals at around that sort of age, at around 50?
At the age of 50, what again I'd look to do is, what are you spending now? That's a very easy thing to work out because most people have very static, bills at that. They're very settled in their standard of living. So you can work out, you spend this much each month, and you have a nice life now, we hope. So, and to have that nice life now, you're spending this much. So that's the first step. You've got some figure you can work with, whether that allows for the extra things you may do in retirement. You've got a core living standards, and if it is even just subsistence standard of living, you've got a figure that you can work towards. So that's really important to do now, because it's quite an easy thing to do. Everyone can look at their bank statement and go, I've spent this much this month based on how much came in, and I had this much difference or whatever. So that's the first thing to do when you're in your sort of 50s, your early 50s. Then think about how that may change in retirement. You think, actually, when I retire, I'd really like to take up XYZ hobby. In Paul's case, I'd like to do more sailing. Or alternatively, I'd like to travel around the world more. You think, okay, well, you're going to have a lot more time to do that. How much are you going to want to do that? Are you going to want to do it 6 months of the year, or is it going to be a couple of weeks of the year? And you think about what you'd like and what your ideals are and your goals and your perfect living standards. So once you had a bit more of a thought about how you envisage seeing your retirement, you may even go, I want to volunteer somewhere, and therefore that's going to take up some of your time as well, and you might have a cost of going there and things like that. But there are lots of possibilities, but it really is about thinking, what's going to make you happy in retirement? What would you like to do if money was no object? And then perhaps work backwards from that and go, okay, these are my resources now. These are what I'm constrained by. How can I use these resources to my best ability to meet that target?
Is it worth thinking much about your state pension?
So the state pension is important. For a lot of people, without a mortgage when you get to retirement, the state pension, particularly if you're in a couple, will probably cover most of your core living costs. So the state pension is about £9,400 a year. And that at the moment is covered by a guarantee that it will increase by the triple lock, which has been suspended. However, it's still going up. And in theory, that will continue going forward. However, it's not guaranteed. But that's a very good, core standard of living, and something that you can use and go, look, when I get to the age of 67, I will have this amount and it will be able to meet my base living costs. So regardless of what happens, I can't work, it doesn't matter, there's another pandemic, you're going to get that income. And everyone gets that income, which is the beauty of it, provided you've done at least 10 years national insurance contributions.
Let's describe what a typical financial situation is, because both Paul and Joe describe quite unique circumstances there. Is there a typical financial situation that people tend to be in at that age of 50?
I wouldn't actually say each of their circumstances are too unique. I'd say I've dealt with lots of clients in both camps in that respect. So I've had lots of clients like Paul, which have had two sort of big employments throughout their career, or one have got a final salary pension and now maybe self-employed or doing reduced hours and things like that. Thinking about retirement in the very near term, if it's possible for them. And I've also dealt with clients like Joe who have had several different careers, lots of pension pots built up, and it's come to that point at retirement. What do I need to do with all my things to make sure I'm best placed for it going forward? So I wouldn't say any of their situations are completely unique. They are not alone. There are lots of people throughout the country that have similar situations to them. And it's sort of about working out what you've got to do. But the beauty you've probably got when you're in your early 50s is that you're likely to be at your peak earnings potential. So you have the capacity to earn a lot more than you're probably spending, and therefore you're very able to save and provide more for your retirement, even though it's closer than, say, a 20-year-old is.
What about if you're like Paul, where you've started something that's a bit more risky later on and you're not putting so much away for retirement, and maybe thinking about the value of that that business or maybe a property at the end there. Is this quite risky, or is there a way of sort of reducing some of those risks around that?
So again, for Paul, I wouldn't say it's too risky for him because he has that, final salary pension backing. Him and his wife are going to have the state pensions as well, so that's a nice level of income. So it's risky in the sense that, if the business went wrong or something like that, he may not be able to replicate his living standards now, but he knows that he's not going to be completely poor in retirement. So Paul can take this risk and hopefully build something up and then sell and have a very nice, comfortable retirement.
Okay, and then for Jo as well, I mean, she's mentioned that she had multiple pensions. Is it worth sort of bringing it under one roof and opening up something like a SIP and sort of managing it from a holistic point of view like that?
So it depends on each of the individual pensions she already has. Some may have some guarantees or things like that, but it's worth looking at all of those. For ease of management, when you get to retirement and get to draw benefits, it certainly makes it a lot easier having them in one place. And it's easier to keep track of and, make sure they're invested in the right places as opposed to tracking 6 different schemes and taking incomes from different pieces and so on. So, getting to that point of retirement, consolidating usually works to your advantage.
Okay. Are there any ways of boosting your provisions when you're around this age?
Yeah. So again, when you get to your 50s, you probably have a nice cash buffer, a cash savings built up. In Jo's case, as an example, she's inherited some investments. Now, if these investments are not doing anything to their best effect for Jo, and she's not really reviewed them or know what they're doing, she could sell the investments and then use that cash, put it into a pension scheme up to 100% of her salary, subject to an act of 40,000, and she's going to get tax relief on top of what she put into that. And so that's a very nice way of boosting your retirement provision with your existing resources. So you haven't gained or had to work any harder or save more that way. It's just about using what you've already got to maximize your pension pot. So anything you put into a pension, the government's going to add tax relief to it. If you're a high rate taxpayer, it's even more attractive. And that can really help in those final years as you approach retirement, just saving as much as you can because you can afford to do so.
And do you, in terms of risk, should you be taking much risk at this stage?
So the old adage was, as you got to retirement, you would de-risk because you're going to buy an annuity. So you need that pot of money. You need some certainty with my pot of X is going to be able to buy an income of Y, and that's it. But as you get to retirement, and you're probably going to enter some form of drawdown because you want the flexibility or whatever, you need to remember you're going to be invested for probably another 30 years. So actually, if you go to low risk now, but live another 30 years, if you think of where the stock markets were 30 years ago from today and how much they've grown over that period, if you were in a low risk rating sort of 30 years ago, you would be massively worse off today than if you stayed invested and stayed taking a sensible level of risk. So I wouldn't say to take extreme levels of risk, but making sure you do remain invested, you do have that sensible time frame, and realistically expect to live until you're 90 at least.
Okay, and how does that contrast to how you might think about retirement when you were a bit younger?
So when you're young, you can afford to take all the risks in the world. You're not going to be able to access your pension until, if you're realistically until you're at least 57, it'll probably increase further. So the access age of a pension is changing for 10 years before the state pension. So that's going to be 57. And, the state pension realistically for a young person is going to go up again. So when you're younger, you can afford to take, maximum risk with your pension because if there is a market crash, it doesn't matter. You can't access it. You can't change your outcome. You could sell the investments, but that's not really recommended, and most people wouldn't do that anyway. They wouldn't look at it. So you can afford to take a much bigger risk. When you get to sort of your 50s, you're going to have an access need. So you wouldn't take the same level of risk as a young person, but you would take some risk just to make sure that your money, isn't being eroded with inflation.
Okay. Paul, I just want to get to your experience when you hit 50. You obviously started your business. I mean, how did you? Was there any change in terms of how you thought about retirement? Was it something that was suddenly a lot more present in your mind at that stage?
I think the circumstances we were in meant, as I said, I couldn't contribute any more towards the pension because we had other focuses, starting up the new business. Something I didn't mention was that the second employer I worked for had a non-contributory pension, so I've been quite lucky from a pension perspective. So that certainly helped.
And Joe, how about you? I mean, at 50, was this a big turning point for you in terms of how you thought about retirement?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, I am on my own, and the thought that, you get to a stage where you're not earning money and there's nobody there to buffer you is a very sobering thought.
And did you find there were any extra goals that had sort of, aside from that, needing to have a larger pot because of living costs, were there any other extra goals that you kind of thought about at that stage?
My biggest goal is to make sure that I've got enough money to carry on being able to do what I like doing. I want to go on holiday. If my friends say, let's go out for dinner, I want to do that. The same care that I have at the moment in terms of how I spend my money, but I don't want to be in a situation where I have to say no more than than I can say yes. It does worry me. I haven't got to a point whereby I have worked it out. And also, I would like to move, but I don't want a big mortgage. I don't want that to be tied to anything. So I need to try and work out how much I need to generate an income when I'm retired. So therefore, how much money could I invest in a property, which means that I don't increase my mortgage enough. And I start there, and then my brain fries and I put it off.
If there was something you would say you could point to that you've done really well, and then maybe something that you would like to have changed when you look back to how you saved for retirement, is there anything you would point to there?
I'm very grateful to my dad for making me a saver. When I was little, I couldn't do something because I spent my pocket money, and ever since then I've made sure that I have that money. But the biggest regret is I don't understand it. I wish that it was more mainstream to talk about, more part of things that we read about, so that you had a base to understand from. Because I feel I don't know anything, and then that means that I just don't do anything.
Okay, so it's sort of analysis paralysis in terms of all the information out there and different services, etc. Paul, how about yourself? Is there something you did well and something you did, you'd like to change maybe if you look back on retirement saving?
I think paying into pensions from an early age was a good thing. You got used to it. You didn't miss the money because it was coming out, before you had the money to spend. So that was always a good thing. I think regrets were we jumped off the housing ladder at a time when house prices went up at a stupid rate. So we've had to sort of play catch up on that basis. So that's probably my biggest my biggest issue over the past, and that's put us in a different financial position than probably most of the people around us at our age. So that's been the biggest challenge.
Felix, just last one for you as well. If you were going to offer a big piece of advice to someone who's 50 and thinking about retirement, maybe a bit concerned, what would it be?
It would be that you don't need to worry about it. You still have time on your side. So you may not be able to retire when you necessarily want to, but you're thinking about it early enough that you can make a sizable dent into catching up. So don't worry too much about what the future holds. Just save as much as you can now, and you will be much better catered for down the line.
Okay, well, I think on that note, plenty packed in there for our listeners to consider. So that brings to an end episode 2 of the Janus Henderson Big 50 Retirement Series. I'd like to thank all of my guests, Joanne Creeks, Paul Botwright and Felix Milton, for their time today. Certainly highlighted, I think, the importance of getting to grips with retirement plans at that watershed age of 50, and then shifting them into this active, I better start doing something about it phase. In our next episode, we're going to look in a little more detail at some of the options you have when it comes to planning and investing for retirement. In the meantime, you can find further information on planning for your financial future via our dedicated retirement planning hub at janushenderson.com/retirement gateway, which can be found by searching for Janus Henderson Investment Trusts in Google. Until next time, goodbye.
This is important information, not for onward distribution. Before investing in an investment trust referred to in this podcast, you should satisfy yourself as to its suitability and the risks involved, and you may wish to consult a financial advisor. This is a marketing communication. Please refer to the AIFMD disclosure document and annual report of the AIF before making any final investment decisions. Past performance does not predict future returns. The value of an investment and the income from it can fall as well as rise, and you may not get back the amount originally invested. Tax assumptions and reliefs depend on an investor's particular circumstances and may change if those circumstances or the law change. Nothing in this podcast is intended to or should be construed as advice. This podcast is not a recommendation to sell or purchase any investment. It does not form part of any contract for the sale or purchase of any investment. We may record telephone calls for our mutual protection, to improve customer service, and for regulatory record-keeping purposes. Issued in the UK by Janus Henderson Investors. Janus Henderson Investors is the name under which investment products and services are provided by Janus Capital International Limited, registration number 3594615, Henderson Global Investors Limited, registration number 906355, Henderson Investment Funds Limited, registration number 2678531, Henderson Equity Partners Limited, registration number 2606646, each registered in England and Wales at 201 Bishopsgate, London, EC2M3AE, and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, as well as Henderson Management S.A, registration number B22848 at de Rue de Bitburg, L1273, Luxembourg, and regulated by the Commission de Surveillance du Secteur Financier. Janus Henderson, Janus, Henderson, Intech, Velocity Shares, Knowledge Shared, Knowledge.shared, and Knowledge Labs are trademarks of Janus Henderson Group plc or one of its subsidiaries. Copyright Janus Henderson Group plc.